My name is Harper Sterling. I am 28 years old, and I am a senior forensic accountant at one of the most prestigious firms in Chicago, specializing in white-collar fraud and complex asset tracing. I spend my professional life meticulously deconstructing layers of deceit hidden within multi-million-dollar spreadsheets, identifying the microscopic discrepancies that lead to the downfall of corporate giants. I am trained to look at the world through a lens of cold, hard evidence, yet I was utterly blind to the structural rot within my own family. My mother, Eleanor Sterling, has a voice that can drop the temperature of a room by 10 degrees, and she proved it again during that phone call. I was sitting in my office on the 42nd floor, looking out at the gray, churning waters of Lake Michigan, when her words sliced through the silence. "He is honestly too good for you anyway, Harper. Just let him go and save us the embarrassment." I could almost hear the clink of ice against the glass of her $14 gin and tonic as she sighed, a sound of weary disappointment she had perfected over 3 decades. The him she was referring to was Julian Vane, a man I had been with for 4 years. Julian was a high-profile architect with a penchant for charcoal-colored tailored suits and an effortless charm that made my parents light up like neon signs. To my mother and my father, Arthur, Julian wasn't just my partner. He was a trophy they desperately wanted to keep in the family display case. The problem, according to my sister Chloe, was that Julian had realized he was settling for the boring, numbers-obsessed daughter when the vibrant, socialite sister was right there. Let me take you back to the beginning of this collapse, to a humid Friday evening in late July at the Sterling estate in Lake Forest. The air was thick with the scent of blooming hydrangeas and the expensive citronella candles flickering in iron lanterns around the perimeter of the limestone patio. My father had just finished grilling prime ribeye steaks on his high-end Lynx Professional grill, a piece of machinery that cost more than most people's first cars. I was standing by the outdoor bar, smoothing the fabric of my navy blue silk wrap dress, feeling the familiar weight of being the outsider in a room full of my own blood. Chloe arrived 30 minutes late, her entrance heralded by the roar of her 2024 Porsche 718 Cayman in racing yellow. She stepped out of the car looking like a filtered version of reality, her blonde hair caught in a perfect messy bun, wearing a sundress that probably cost half my monthly mortgage payment. She didn't look at me first. She looked at Julian. And Julian, who was usually the anchor of my world, looked back with an intensity that made my stomach do a slow, nauseating roll. That night was the first time I saw the lie in my sister's eyes. We were sitting around the mahogany outdoor table, the flickering candlelight casting long, distorted shadows across the silver cutlery. Chloe was describing her latest failed business venture, a boutique wellness brand that had burned through a $60,000 investment from our father in less than 6 months. But as she spoke, she wasn't looking for sympathy from our parents. She was leaning toward Julian, her hand grazing his forearm as she laughed. Julian didn't pull away. Instead, he adjusted his glasses, a pair of Tom Ford frames I had bought him for his birthday, and leaned into her space. I remember the exact sensory details of that moment. The sound of a distant lawnmower, the smell of charred meat and expensive perfume, and the cold realization that my life was about to be dismantled. My mother noticed my silence and misinterpreted it as jealousy, which in her mind was a character flaw. "Harper, don't look so sour," she had said, waving a manicured hand toward me. "Not everyone can have Chloe's spirit. Some of us are meant for the ledgers, and some are meant for the light." But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you have to understand the dynamic of the Sterling household. Growing up, I was the reliable one. I was the one who got the scholarship to the University of Chicago, the one who never missed a deadline, the one who handled the estate taxes after my grandfather passed away. Chloe was the golden child who could do no wrong, even when she was doing everything wrong. She was the one who crashed cars and got them replaced within 48 hours. She was the one who dropped out of 3 different colleges because she couldn't find her vibe. And yet I was the one who was constantly told to be more like her. The phone call from my mother came exactly 3 days after Chloe told me, with tears that looked remarkably like the fake ones she used to get out of grounding in high school, that Julian had confessed his love for her. She sat in my living room, perched on the edge of my gray velvet sofa, smelling of Joe Malone peony and blush suede. "Harper, it just happened," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility. "We tried to fight it, but the soul wants what it wants. Julian says he's felt trapped by your expectations for years. He needs someone who understands his creative fire, not someone who audits his life every weekend." I didn't scream. I didn't throw her out. I sat in my Eames lounge chair, my hands folded in my lap, and I looked at her with the same analytical detachment I use when I find a hidden offshore account. I saw the way her eyes darted to the side when she mentioned Julian's confession. I saw the way she gripped her designer handbag, a small nervous tic she's had since she was 6. It was a discrepancy. It was a red flag in a sea of emotional data. When I spoke to Julian later that night, he didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. He stood in the kitchen of our shared condo, a space we had spent $80,000 renovating just last year. He was packing a Toomey suitcase with the meticulousness of a man who was leaving a hotel, not a life. "Harper, your mother is right," he said, his voice flat. "You're too much. Everything is a calculation with you. I can't live in a world where everything has to be verified. Chloe she just accepts me." The betrayal wasn't just about the man I thought I would marry. It was about the coordinated effort to erase my value. Over the next week, my parents didn't check on me. They didn't ask how I was handling the end of a 4-year relationship. Instead, they organized a dinner at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse to celebrate Chloe's new relationship. They invited Julian. They acted as if I were a footnote in a story that had finally found its true protagonists. I sat in my apartment, the silence echoing against the high ceilings. I looked at the joint bank account statements, the shared credit card bills from our Chase Sapphire Reserve, and the digital trail of our lives. As a forensic accountant, I know that people always leave a paper trail, even when they think they've been careful. I started to dig. Not because I wanted Julian back, but because the numbers in my head weren't adding up. Chloe didn't have the money for a yellow Porsche. My father's manufacturing company, Sterling Industrial, had been reporting record profits, yet his personal withdrawals were erratic and massive. I spent 18 hours a day buried in data. I used my access to premium databases and my network of contacts in the financial world to trace the flow of money. I wasn't just looking for a reason why Julian left. I was looking for the reason why my family was so desperate to keep him close. What I found was a web of debt and deceit that made my sister's betrayal look like child's play. My father's company wasn't thriving. It was a hollowed-out shell, propped up by high-interest loans and a series of questionable investments in Julian's architectural firm. Julian wasn't just a boyfriend. He was a silent partner in a scheme to keep the Sterling name from plunging into bankruptcy. The embarrassment my mother mentioned on the phone wasn't about me losing a boyfriend. It was about the fear that if I looked too closely, I would see the cracks in their gilded cage. They needed Julian's reputation and his firm's cash flow to stay afloat. Chloe was the bait used to ensure Julian stayed in the family fold when he started to get cold feet about the business dealings with my father. I remember the smell of the old paper in the archives I visited, the sterile scent of my office as the sun set behind the Sears Tower, and the rhythmic clicking of my mechanical keyboard as I compiled the evidence. I felt a strange, cold peace. My name is Harper Sterling, and for 28 years I was told I was the boring one because I cared about the truth. But the truth is a dangerous thing when you've built your life on a foundation of lies. My mother called again that evening, her tone slightly more frantic. "Harper, I hope you're not planning on making a scene at the club this weekend. We've already cleared your things from the lake house. It's better this way. Julian and Chloe need their space to build a future. You've always been so independent. I'm sure you'll find someone more suited to your temperament. Maybe another accountant?" I stared at the screen of my laptop, where a spreadsheet showed a 6-figure transfer from my father's business account to an offshore entity controlled by Julian's firm. "Suitability is a funny word, Mom," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the pain she expected to hear. "I think I've found exactly what I'm suited for." I hung up before she could respond. I picked up my pen, a black Mont Blanc that had been a graduation gift from my grandmother, the only person in this family who had ever truly seen me. I began to draft the final report. This wasn't just about a breakup anymore. This was an audit. And in my world, when the audit begins, nobody gets to hide. The ice in my mother's drink was melting, and the empire my father built was about to follow suit. I looked at the time on my desk clock, a sleek digital piece that flickered 11:47 p.m. The world was quiet, but in the rows and columns of my screen, a storm was brewing. I was no longer the daughter they could dismiss. I was the one holding the ledger, and the debt was finally coming due. The contrast between my sister and me can be quantified with surgical precision, and it is a $3.2 million gap that defines every interaction within the Sterling household. My sister Kennedy is 25 years old and carries herself with the unearned confidence of someone who has never seen a past due notice or felt the frantic heat of a dwindling bank balance. She is an aspiring actress, a title that in our family serves as a convenient euphemism for being professionally unemployed while living a life entirely subsidized by a $6,500 monthly allowance from our parents, Grant and Victoria. While Kennedy spent her Tuesday afternoons at high-end vegan bistros in West Hollywood, I was hunched over a dual-monitor setup in a windowless office, pulling 70-hour weeks to dismantle my $82,000 student loan debt. I managed to kill that debt in exactly 42 months through a regime of fiscal austerity that would have made a monk look decadent, surviving on meal-prepped chicken and frozen vegetables while Kennedy was ordering room service at the Chateau Marmont on my father's Amex Black Card. In the lexicon of the Sterling family, I was always labeled as the reliable one, a term that I eventually realized was just their coded language for the one we can ignore. Being reliable meant I didn't cause scenes at charity galas, I didn't get arrested for driving a leased Range Rover under the influence at 2 a.m, and I didn't require an emotional or financial bailout every fiscal quarter. Consequently, my presence became invisible, a background texture to the high-stakes drama of Kennedy's carefully curated existence. I remember walking into our family's summer home in Lake Geneva, wearing a $40 Target blazer that I had meticulously steamed to hide the fraying hem, only to find Kennedy unboxing a pair of $1,200 Balenciaga Triple S sneakers in optic white. She didn't even look up as I entered, her thumb scrolling through her Instagram feed as she debated whether the lighting was better on the limestone patio or near the infinity pool. The disparity wasn't just in the objects we owned, but in the very air we were allowed to breathe. When I achieved my promotion to senior forensic accountant, a position that came with a grueling certification process and a background check that peered into every corner of my soul, my mother, Victoria, simply nodded and asked if I could help Kennedy figure out why her Venmo wasn't linking to her new platinum secondary card. There was no celebratory dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant for me, no toast raised to my hard work, or the fact that I was now earning a base salary of $145,000 a year without a dime of their help. But when Kennedy landed a 3-line role as a background waitress in a low-budget indie pilot, my father, Grant, opened a bottle of 2012 Screaming Eagle Cabernet Sauvignon that cost more than my first 3 months of rent in my cramped Lincoln Park studio. I watched them pour that wine, the deep ruby liquid swirling in regal crystal glasses, and I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I stood there in my off-the-rack professional wear, smelling of the CTA red line and the cheap espresso from the office break room, while they toasted to the artistic soul of the family. Grant, who built a manufacturing empire on the back of cold logic and aggressive litigation, looked at Kennedy with a softness he never afforded me. He saw her as a delicate investment that required constant watering, whereas I was seen as an automated system that required no maintenance and provided no entertainment. To them, my success was a foregone conclusion and therefore uninteresting, while Kennedy's failures were tragedies that required their heroic intervention. This financial and emotional chasm was bridged only by my utility. I was the one called upon to review the complicated tax structures of Grant's shell companies, and I was the one who quietly fixed the discrepancies in the family trust when my mother's spending at Neiman Marcus exceeded her discretionary limits. I treated their finances with the same forensic rigor I applied to my corporate clients, noting every extravagant waste and every bleeding wound in their portfolio. I saw the six-figure transfers to Kennedy's failed clothing line, the $20,000 bills for her spiritual retreats in Sedona, and the constant drain of her lifestyle on a business that was secretly beginning to stagger under the weight of its own hubris. They thought I was just doing my job, that I was happy to be the quiet architect of their stability, but every time I saw a $1,200 charge for sneakers on a card I was responsible for reconciling, a part of my loyalty fractured. I would sit in my apartment, which I had furnished with floor models from West Elm and thrifted books, and I would look at the digital trail of their indulgence. I knew exactly how much the sterling name cost to maintain, and I knew exactly how much of that cost was being squeezed out of my father's increasingly desperate maneuvers. While Kennedy was buying into a dream of fame that would never materialize, I was buying into the reality of their eventual collapse. The resentment didn't come all at once. It was a slow accumulation of microscopic slights. It was the way Victoria would comment on the sensible heels I wore, suggesting I get something more feminine like the Jimmy Choos she bought for Kennedy's birthday. It was the way Grant would interrupt my stories about a complex fraud case I had broken open to ask if I had seen Kennedy's latest TikTok dance. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need the $6,500 allowance, and because I didn't need it, they assumed I didn't need anything else either. They mistook my silence for contentment and my independence for a lack of desire. I remember one specific Saturday morning when the heat in Chicago was so stifling that the asphalt seemed to shimmer like a mirage. I had driven out to their estate to drop off some urgent signature pages for a property transfer in Greenwich. I pulled my modest, well-maintained 2019 Honda Civic into the driveway, parking it behind Kennedy's racing yellow Porsche. The contrast was almost comical, a visual representation of our status within the family hierarchy. I walked into the kitchen, which smelled of expensive French-pressed coffee and the lemon-scented wood polish the cleaning crew used twice a week. Kennedy was sitting at the marble island, wearing a silk robe that probably cost $500, complaining to our mother about the stress of her upcoming headshot session. She needed another $3,000 for a specific photographer who worked with the stars. Victoria didn't even hesitate. She just tapped something on her iPad and told Kennedy it was taken care of. When I stepped into the room, Victoria looked at me as if I were a delivery person who had arrived through the wrong door. "Oh, Harper, you're here," she said, her voice flat. "Put the papers on the desk in the library, and try not to wake your father. He had a very stressful meeting with the board last night." I didn't say a word about the fact that I had stayed up until 3 a.m. preparing those very papers. I didn't mention that I had bypassed a weekend trip with my own friends to ensure their Greenwich deal didn't fall through due to a technicality in the escrow agreement. I just nodded, walked to the library, and placed the documents on the mahogany desk. As I stood there, surrounded by my father's leather-bound books and the silent evidence of a fortune I was protecting but not sharing, I realized that being reliable was a trap I had built for myself. I had spent 42 months paying off $82,000 in loans to prove I didn't need them, and in doing so, I had rendered myself unnecessary in their eyes. Kennedy's life was a series of expensive mistakes that kept them engaged and vital. My life was a series of quiet successes that made them feel nothing. I looked at the Amex Black card sitting on the corner of the desk, the same one Kennedy used for her Balenciaga sneakers, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. They didn't see the 7-hour weeks, the Target blazers, or the exhausted circles under my eyes. They only saw a tool that worked perfectly and therefore required no thought. But every forensic accountant knows that the most dangerous errors are the ones that occur in the most trusted systems. The $3.2 million gap wasn't just a difference in our bank accounts. It was the measure of how much they were willing to lose before they realized the reliable daughter was the only thing standing between them and the abyss. I turned and walked out of the library, the sound of my sensible heels clicking against the hardwood like a countdown they were too distracted to hear. The world was watching Kennedy, but I was the one watching the clock, and the time for being ignored was rapidly coming to an end. The betrayal did not happen with a grand cinematic explosion, but rather with the clinical precision of a digital execution at exactly 11:24 p.m. on a Friday night, inside the sterile, high-end silence of the Fairmont, Chicago. I was sitting at the mahogany desk in Suite 1402, the ambient glow of the city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long and distorted shadows across the heavy ivory cardstock of my wedding vows. I had spent the last 3 hours agonizing over every word, trying to capture the quiet stability that Liam brought to my life, while sipping on a $9 bottle of Fiji water I had taken from the minibar. The room smelled faintly of lavender cleaning solution and expensive upholstery, a scent that will now be forever anchored to the moment my world was systematically dismantled. My phone, a graphite iPhone 15 Pro Max, vibrated against the desk with such violence that it startled me, the caller ID flashing the name of the man I was supposed to marry in less than 48 hours. When I answered, I expected to hear his usual calm, melodic cadence, perhaps a last-minute nerves-driven check-in about the seating chart for our $68,000 wedding at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Instead, the voice on the other end was unrecognizable, a jagged and guttural mess of sobbing and incoherent rage that sent a physical chill down my spine. Liam didn't greet me. He simply began to scream about the images he had just received, his words coming out in panicked, breathless bursts that felt like physical blows. Kennedy, my sister, the aspiring actress who had spent her entire life perfecting the art of the performance, had sent him 4 high-resolution photos that appeared to capture the definitive end of our relationship. In the digital clarity of those images, I was seen entering a hotel room at the Fairmont with a tall man in a distressed black leather jacket, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back as I supposedly led him into the shadows of a room that wasn't mine. It was a setup of such calculated cruelty that it took my breath away, a staged masterpiece that cost Kennedy exactly $200 an hour to hire a professional extra from a local talent agency in the West Loop. While I had been inside my suite, focused on my professional obligations and my future, a man whose name I didn't even know was being directed by my own sister to play the role of my secret lover right outside my door. She had timed it perfectly, knowing I would be alone, knowing the lighting in the hallway would provide just enough ambiguity to make the woman in the photo, who wore a navy blue wrap dress identical to the one I had worn to dinner, look exactly like me from a distance. She hadn't just lied. She had produced a high production value fiction and delivered it to the one person whose trust was my only sanctuary. Liam didn't wait for an explanation, and the more I tried to speak, the more his voice escalated into a frantic, broken staccato of betrayal. He told me that he had already called the venue, the caterers, and the florist, and that the $68,000 investment into our future was being liquidated into cancellation fees and shattered promises right then and there. I sat on the edge of the plush, king-sized bed, clutching the bottle of Fiji water until my knuckles turned white, listening to the man I loved tell me that he never wanted to see my face again. The irony was suffocating. I was a forensic accountant who spent my days identifying the minute details of fraud, yet I was currently being convicted by a fraudulent narrative created by my own flesh and blood. Kennedy had used the very tools of my trade against me, creating a paper trail of visual evidence that was designed to bypass logic and strike directly at Liam's deepest insecurities. The technical execution of her plan was flawless, reflecting the dark side of her failed acting ambitions, as she had even managed to capture the room number in the background of the shot to ensure there was no doubt about the location. She knew Liam's history with his previous partner's infidelity, and she pushed that specific, agonizing button with the cold detachment of a sociopath. As the call disconnected, leaving me in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight, I realized that the reliable daughter had finally been neutralized. I stood up and walked to the door, opening it to find the hallway empty, the floral-patterned carpet offering no clues to the staged crime that had just occurred there. The air in the Fairmont felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room by the sheer magnitude of the injustice. I remembered the way Kennedy had looked at me during the rehearsal dinner earlier that week, her eyes sparkling with a predatory light as she toasted to our happiness with a glass of Veuve Clicquot that my father had paid for. She had been planning this while she hugged me, while she laughed with Liam, and while she accepted my help with her mounting credit card debts. The 4 photos were not just images, they were the culmination of years of resentment, the $3.2 million gap finally manifesting as a total scorched earth policy. She didn't just want my boyfriend, she wanted to destroy the only thing I had that she couldn't buy with an Amex Black Card, my reputation for integrity. I spent the next hour in a state of hyper-analytical shock, my brain automatically beginning to deconstruct the evidence even as my heart was breaking. I looked at the metadata of the photos Liam had forwarded in a final, scathing text message. The timestamps were exactly 5 minutes apart, ranging from 10:42 to 10:47 p.m., a window of time when I had stepped out briefly to ask the housekeeping staff for extra towels. I remembered seeing a man in the hallway, someone I didn't recognize who had lingered near the ice machine, but I had been too preoccupied with my vows to give him a second glance. Kennedy must have been hiding around the corner with her high-end DSLR camera, the one our parents bought her for her 21st birthday, waiting for that 5-minute window to execute her scene. The cost of the wedding was a drop in the bucket compared to the cost of the lost trust, but the numbers still haunted me. $52 per plate for the hors d'oeuvres, $4,000 for the custom floral arrangements, and $12,000 for the band that was now being told to stay home. My father, Grant, would likely be furious about the wasted money, but knowing his history, he would find a way to blame me for not being interesting enough to keep Liam's attention. My mother, Victoria, would probably be more concerned about the social embarrassment of a canceled wedding than the fact that her eldest daughter was currently sitting in a hotel room with her life in tatters. They would side with Kennedy's drama because drama is a language they understand, whereas the quiet, boring truth of my innocence would require them to actually look at the monster they had raised. I walked back to the desk and looked at my vows. The words I had written about honesty and building a life on a firm foundation now looking like a mockery of my current reality. I took the Mont Blanc pen and drew a single heavy line through the entire first paragraph. My name is Harper Sterling, and I have spent my career proving that the truth is always hidden in the fine print. Kennedy thought she could use a $200 an hour extra to rewrite my biography, but she forgot one crucial detail. Actors perform for an audience, but forensic accountants work for the record. She had destroyed my wedding and my relationship in a single night of staged performance, but she had also given me the one thing I needed to finally stop being the reliable daughter who stays quiet. She had given me a motive. As the clock on the nightstand ticked toward 1 a.m, the blue light of my laptop screen illuminated the room. I didn't call Liam back to plead. I knew he was beyond listening, his mind poisoned by the high-resolution betrayal he thought he saw. Instead, I opened my encrypted work drive and accessed the files I had been compiling on Sterling Industrial and the suspicious transfers to Julian Vane's firm. If my family wanted to play with fictions and high-stakes gambles, I was going to show them what happens when a professional auditor decides to go through every single line item of their lives. The $68,000 was gone, the man I loved was gone, and the navy blue silk dress was crumpled on the floor like a discarded skin. I was no longer Harper the reliable, the one who could be ignored while Kennedy bought Balenciaga sneakers on the family's dime. I was the person who was going to find every hidden lie, every forged signature, and every cent that Kennedy had drained from the company to fund her lifestyle. The betrayal at the Fairmont was the end of my life as I knew it. But as I sat there in the dark, The only sound the hum of the air conditioning and the distant siren of a Chicago police car. I knew it was also the beginning of an audit they would never survive. Family isn't blood when that blood is willing to spill yours for a moment of spotlight, and as I deleted the draft of my vows, I replaced it with a list of names and accounts. The clock was still ticking, and for the first time in 28 years, I wasn't afraid of the silence. I was the storm that was coming for them, and I would be as cold and uncompromising as the data that never lies. I sat on the edge of the plush king-sized bed in Suite 1402 of the Fairmont, Chicago, the high thread count Egyptian cotton sheets feeling like sandpaper against my skin as the weight of the last 3 hours began to settle into my marrow. My eyes were fixed on a laser-printed copy of our wedding seating chart, a document I had meticulously organized over the course of 8 months, now rendered as nothing more than a list of casualties in a war I hadn't known I was fighting. There were 185 names on that list, arranged across 22 tables, representing a collective history of friendships, professional alliances, and family obligations that had been severed with a single phone call. I looked at the line item for the 12-course tasting menu we had selected at $68 per person and the $12,400 invoice for the floral arrangements alone, consisting of rare white orchids and hand-wired lilies that were currently being stored in a temperature-controlled van somewhere in the city. I did not cry, because as a senior forensic accountant, I have been trained to understand that emotion is a secondary characteristic of a crisis, and that data is the only thing that can provide a path to a resolution. My breathing was shallow but rhythmic, smelling of the stale city air and the faint, lingering scent of the lavender-infused linen spray the hotel staff used during turn-down service. Instead of collapsing into the grief that Kennedy expected of me, I reached for my 16-inch MacBook Pro, the metal casing cold against my thighs as I settled into the task of deconstructing the lie. I had a specific advantage that Kennedy had overlooked in her haste to play the role of the villain, which was my brother-in-law, Marcus, who worked in high-level cybersecurity for the Hilton chain and had once shown me the back-end vulnerabilities of cloud-based security portals used by luxury hotels. Using the administrative credentials he had shared with me during a deep-dive conversation about data encryption 3 years ago, I bypassed the standard guest restrictions and gained access to the Fairmont's internal surveillance feed for the 14th floor. The interface was a grid of charcoal grays and grainy blues, but the high-definition cameras installed last spring provided a crystal-clear view of the hallway directly outside my door. I scrolled through the digital timeline, my eyes scanning the flickering images of empty hallways and the occasional passing staff member until I hit the timestamp for 10:14 and 22 seconds p.m. There, in the harsh fluorescent glow of the corridor, was the definitive proof of my sister's treachery, captured in a frame-by-frame sequence that no amount of acting could ever explain away. I saw Kennedy standing near the ice machine, wearing her expensive silk robe and holding her iPhone like a director's viewfinder, her face twisted into an expression of focused malice that I had never seen before. Standing next to her was the man in the leather jacket, the $200 an hour extra she had procured to destroy my life, and he looked remarkably bored as he checked his own watch. I watched as Kennedy pulled a wad of $20 bills from her pocket and handed them to him, her lips moving rapidly as she gave him final instructions. She pointed directly at the brass numbers on my door, Suite 1402, and then she gestured for him to move into a specific position that would catch the light from the overhead fixture. It was a rehearsal, a disgusting and calculated pantomime designed to simulate a betrayal, and seeing it in the raw, unedited format of security footage felt like watching a surgical incision being made in my own heart. The man nodded, pocketed the cash, and waited for her signal, and then at exactly 10:42 p.m., the sequence Liam had seen was executed with the precision of a stage play. Kennedy retreated into the shadow of a service alcove, her camera raised, as the actor leaned against my doorframe and waited for me to step out for the towels I had requested. The footage showed me opening the door, looking confused as I saw him standing there, and the way he leaned in to whisper something entirely nonsensical to me just to create the visual of intimacy for the camera. To anyone looking at a still photo, it appeared as though we were sharing a private, heated moment. But the video showed the truth of my immediate recoil and the way I pulled the door shut after he realized he had the shot. It was all there, the entire architecture of the lie, documented in the cold, unfeeling code of the security portal. I sat in the blue light of the laptop screen for several hours, the silence of the room punctuated only by the distant hum of the elevator and the rhythmic ticking of my own internal clock as I processed the magnitude of the financial and emotional fraud. My decision was finally made at exactly 2:45 a.m., a time when the rest of the city was asleep, but my mind was operating with the clarity of a high-speed processor. I realized that if I simply showed Liam the footage, I might save the wedding, but I would not fix the rot at the center of my family. Kennedy would find another way to strike, and my parents would continue to subsidize her warfare while ignoring my contributions. The $68,000 was a sunk cost, a premium paid for a lesson in the true nature of my kin, and I decided right then that I would not be the victim of this story. I would not plead for Liam's trust, nor would I beg for my mother's understanding, because they had both proven that their loyalty was as thin as the paper my seating chart was printed on. I began to download the footage, saving it into 3 separate encrypted cloud drives and a physical thumb drive I kept in my laptop bag. I then opened my work folders, pulling up the forensic audit I had been conducting on Sterling Industrial, my father's manufacturing firm. I looked at the unauthorized transfers, the creative accounting used to hide Kennedy's $6,500 monthly allowance as a consulting fee, and the massive debts being shuffled between shell companies to maintain the illusion of wealth. I saw the $3.2 million gap not just as a difference in lifestyle, but as a criminal liability that my father had been desperate to keep buried. By attempting to ruin me, Kennedy had inadvertently forced me to stop protecting the family business, and as I looked at the time on my screen, I felt a sense of liberation that was sharper than any pain I had felt when Liam called. I spent the remaining hours of the night drafting a series of emails, none of which were to Liam or my parents. I wrote to the lead investigator at the IRS with whom I had worked on a previous corporate fraud case, and I prepared a detailed memorandum for the board of directors at Sterling Industrial, outlining the systematic embezzlement occurring under Grant Sterling's watch. I felt a strange, detached peace as I typed, the clicking of the keys sounding like the final nails in the coffin of the Sterling reputation. I thought about the $12,400 in flowers that would never be seen, and the 185 guests who would receive a cancellation notice in the morning, and I realized that the true wedding I was preparing for was my own marriage to the truth. I was no longer the reliable daughter who quietly paid off $82,000 in loans while her sister bought Balenciagas. I was the auditor who was about to liquidate their entire world. The sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, casting a pale, sickly yellow light into the suite, and I stood up to stretch my cramped muscles. I walked to the window and looked down at the street, where a black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe was idling near the entrance of the hotel. I knew that within 24 hours the news of the canceled wedding would break and the whispers would start at the country club. But I also knew that the documents I was about to send would make a canceled wedding look like a minor inconvenience. My name is Harper Sterling, and while my sister spent $200 an hour to stage a lie, I was going to spend the rest of my life ensuring that every single one of their secrets was brought into the light. The betrayal at 11:24 p.m. was the end of my innocence, but the decision at 2:45 a.m. was the birth of my power. I closed my MacBook Pro with a definitive snap, the sound echoing in the empty suite like a gavel, and I walked into the bathroom to wash the scent of the Fairmont from my skin. I had a lot of work to do, and for the first time in 28 years, I didn't care about saving anyone but myself. The audit was no longer a professional task. It was a personal mandate, and the Sterling family was about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the girl who knows where all the numbers are hidden. I looked at myself in the mirror, noticing the dark circles under my eyes and the sharp set of my jaw. And I didn't see a jilted bride. I saw a woman who was finally, undeniably in control of the ledger. The $3.2 million gap was about to become their prison, and I was the one who held the keys to the evidence locker. I walked back into the room, picked up the $9 bottle of Fiji water and drank the last of it, ready to face the wreckage of the day with the cold, hard certainty of the data I carried. I did not call a therapist to process the trauma of my canceled wedding, nor did I reach out to a crisis hotline to manage the sudden collapse of my 4-year relationship with Liam, because emotional catharsis is a luxury I could not afford while my reputation was being incinerated by a $200 an hour performance. Instead, I reached into my professional network and called Detective Marcus Thorne, a veteran private investigator and former fraud division lead whom I have utilized for several high-stakes corporate audits involving complex asset concealment and embezzlement. Marcus is the kind of man who speaks in short sentences and understands the urgent necessity of digital forensics. And for a $1,500 rush fee paid via an encrypted wire transfer, he agreed to prioritize my personal catastrophe over his current caseload. By the time the sun was fully visible over the Chicago skyline, casting a cold, clinical light across the remnants of my discarded wedding vows, I had a digital war folder compiled and secured on a $25 Kingston USB drive that I kept gripped in my hand like a weapon. This small plastic device contained the absolute deconstruction of Kennedy's character, starting with the 1080p high-definition security footage from the Fairmont's 14th floor, which clearly showed my sister directing her hired actor like a seasoned cinematographer. The folder was a masterpiece of forensic evidence featuring a $400 PayPal receipt paid to Ace Talent Agency for the services of an extra specializing in lifestyle background work, which Kennedy had foolishly paid from her primary account tied to her legal name. Marcus had also managed to intercept a string of text messages from a burner phone Kennedy had purchased at a CVS on Wacker Drive 3 days prior, where she bragged to an unnamed contact about finally getting the spotlight back and how easy it was to manipulate a man like Liam, who was already primed for suspicion. I sat in the silent suite, the air conditioning humming at a steady 68 degrees, and I reviewed every file with the detached scrutiny of an auditor who has just discovered a massive hole in a balance sheet. There was a specific text sent at 11:48 p.m., just minutes after Liam had called me in a state of breakdown, where Kennedy wrote that the boring accountant was finally being deleted and that the Sterling throne was once again occupied by the daughter who actually mattered. The sheer narcissism of the phrasing didn't even hurt me anymore, because it provided a perfect psychological profile for the report I was building, which now included not only her personal betrayal, but the clear evidence of her using family funds to facilitate a character assassination. The war folder also contained a secondary directory where I had moved the financial discrepancies I had been tracking within Sterling Industrial, including a series of forged signatures on corporate resolutions that looked remarkably similar to Kennedy's handwriting when she was trying to mimic our father's flourish. I realized that my sister hadn't just been playing with my life, but she had been playing with the very foundation of the family's wealth, using her proximity to our father Grant to siphon off small but consistent amounts of capital to fund her aspiring actress lifestyle. As the clock on the nightstand ticked toward 8 in the morning, I felt a profound sense of realignment, as if the $3.2 million gap that had always defined our relationship was finally starting to narrow, not because she had gained value, but because I was about to liquidate hers. I spent 30 minutes organizing the files into a logical progression, starting with the motive and ending with the financial impact, and I felt a cold surge of adrenaline that no amount of expensive wedding champagne could ever provide. I was no longer the reliable one who could be ignored, or the sister who wore $40 Target blazers while Kennedy draped herself in designer labels, because I was now the primary investigator in the case of Sterling versus Sterling. Every forensic accountant knows that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has nothing left to lose but the evidence. And as I looked at the Kingston Drive, I realized it was the most valuable thing I had ever owned. I packed my belongings into my Toomey suitcase, the same brand Liam had packed so meticulously just hours before, and I left Suite 1402 without looking back at the seating chart or the $12,400 floral arrangements that would soon be wilted and discarded. I drove my 2019 Honda Civic away from the Fairmont and toward a quiet breakfast diner where I could utilize a secure VPN to send the first wave of emails that would initiate the collapse of Kennedy's carefully constructed fiction. I ordered a black coffee and a plate of dry toast, the cost being exactly $6.85 plus tip, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction in the modest expense compared to the $68,000 wedding I was no longer paying for. The texts on the USB drive were the smoking gun showing that Kennedy had even coached the actor on how to stand to maximize the appearance of intimacy and how she had planned to be the one to comfort Liam once the news broke. My name is Harper Sterling, and while my sister was joking about spotlights and thrones, I was focusing on the cold, hard reality of the penal code and the fiduciary duties she had violated within the family business. Marcus Thorne had delivered the data, but it was my expertise that would weaponize it into a legal and social death sentence for the golden child of the Sterling family. I looked at the time on my phone, which now read 8:12 a.m., and I knew that the rest of my family would be waking up in their Lake Forest estate, oblivious to the fact that their digital footprints had already been harvested and categorized. Kennedy's arrogance had been her undoing because she assumed that my reliability meant a lack of imagination, when in reality, it meant I had spent my entire life learning exactly how to build a case that cannot be dismantled. The 4 photos she had sent to Liam were high resolution, but they were still lies, and the truth I held on that $25 drive was a 10-gigabyte bomb that was timed to go off at the precise moment of her greatest triumph. I didn't need a therapist because I had a detective and a database, and as I took the first sip of my bitter diner coffee, I knew that the audit of the Sterling family had officially moved from the investigation phase to the execution phase. The contrast between us was no longer about sneakers and student loans, but about the difference between a girl who plays a part and a woman who knows the facts, and as the data uploaded to the cloud, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that had been there since I was a child. I was going to show my parents, Grant and Victoria, exactly what their $6,500 a month allowance had purchased, and I was going to show Liam that the woman he was so quick to discard was the only person who had ever been truly honest with him. The Betrayal at 11:24 p.m. was a masterful performance, but the digital war folder was the final curtain call that Kennedy never saw coming. And as the progress bar on my laptop reached 100%, I closed the lid with a sense of finality. There would be no wedding, no toasts, and no happy endings for the people who thought my silence was a sign of weakness, because the reliable daughter was finally taking her seat at the head of the table. I sat in that diner surrounded by the smell of grease and cheap coffee, and I felt more alive than I had in years, because for the first time in my life, the numbers in my head and the reality in front of me were in perfect alignment. The audit was complete, the evidence was secured, and the reckoning was about to begin for everyone who had underestimated the girl with the Target blazer and the Kingston Drive. The setup for the afternoon was an architectural masterpiece of social engineering and orchestrated tragedy, designed by Kennedy to serve as her ultimate coronation, while I was meant to be the invisible casualty. Despite the frantic, heart-wrenching phone call from Liam the night before, and the theoretical cancellation of our $68,000 wedding, I did not call the venue to release the staff, nor did I instruct the florists to stop their work on the $12,400 orchid arrangements. I showed up at the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Chicago at precisely 1:00 p.m., moving through the opulent gold-leafed foyer with a cold, terrifying clarity that felt like liquid nitrogen in my veins. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of high-end lilies and the hushed, predatory whispers of 185 guests who had arrived expecting a celebration but were instead consuming a scandal. Kennedy was already there, positioned near the center of the room like a tragic heroine in a theater production, wearing a $2,800 custom silk bridesmaid dress in a shade of champagne that perfectly complemented her calculated pallor. She was moving from group to group, her voice a practiced tremolo of manufactured grief as she leaned into our aunts and cousins, whispering that Harper just couldn't help herself and that I had always been fundamentally self-destructive. She looked triumphant, her eyes bright with the adrenaline of a successful heist, her hand resting frequently on her chest to draw attention to the sheer sincerity of her lie. To the onlookers, she was the grieving sister holding the family together, while I was the erratic accountant who had thrown away a perfect life for a tawdry hotel room encounter. Liam was seated in the front row of the ivory-draped chairs, and seeing him felt like a physical blow to my sternum. He was ghost white, his features sunken and shadowed by a night of sleepless agony. He looked fragile, a shell of the man I had intended to marry, and his hands were shaking with such uncontrollable intensity that he fumbled with his wrist, accidentally dropping his $14,000 Omega Seamaster onto the marble floor. The sharp, metallic clatter of the luxury timepiece hitting the stone echoed through the sudden silence of the room, a sound that felt like the final snap of our shared history. He didn't even reach down to pick it up, his gaze fixed on the floor with a 1,000-yard stare that made my heart ache with a brief, flickering remnant of the love I had for him before the forensic coldness took over again. I didn't enter from the back like a traditional bride, and I wasn't wearing the $6,000 Vera Wang gown that was currently hanging in a garment bag back in Suite 1402. Instead, I wore a crisp, tailored black power suit and the same $40 Target blazer I had kept as a reminder of my own grit. I walked down the center aisle with a steady, unhurried pace, the clicking of my heels against the marble providing a rhythmic countdown to the end of the Sterling family, as the world knew them. The guests turned in their seats, their faces a mosaic of shock, pity, and morbid curiosity. But I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the altar, where the stunned officiant stood holding a leather-bound book, looking between me and the empty space where a groom should be. Kennedy froze mid-sentence, her hand still clutching a lace handkerchief, her expression flickering from faux sympathy to a jagged, sharp-edged panic as she realized I wasn't at home crying into a pillow. I reached the front of the room, stepped up onto the dais, and without a single word of greeting or apology, I reached out and took the Silver Shore microphone from the trembling hand of the officiant. The feedback hummed through the vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom for a split second before the silence became absolute, a vacuum of sound where even the air seemed to stop moving. I looked down at Liam, who finally raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a confusing mixture of hatred and hope. And then I turned my gaze toward Kennedy, who was standing just 5 feet away. She tried to step forward, her mouth opening to perhaps launch one final preemptive strike, but I held up a single hand, a gesture of such absolute authority that she stopped in her tracks. My name is Harper Sterling, and I have spent my entire professional life finding the truth in the places where people hide it best. And today I am going to share a very expensive piece of evidence with all of you. The technical setup I had arranged during the early morning hours was already in place, with my MacBook Pro synced to the ballroom's massive dual projection screens that usually displayed romantic montages of the happy couple. I didn't look at the screen as I tapped a command on the wireless remote in my pocket. I watched Kennedy's face instead. The 1080p security footage from the 14th floor flickered to life, the grainy charcoal and blue of the Fairmont's hallway illuminating the gold-leafed room with a haunting, clinical light. There was no music, only the raw, ambient sound of the hallway, and then the image of Kennedy appeared, standing by the ice machine, pulling a wad of $20 bills from her silk robe and handing them to the man in the leather jacket. I saw the collective gasp of 185 people ripple through the room like a wave, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock that drowned out the hum of the air conditioning. I watched the color drain from Kennedy's face until she was as white as the orchids surrounding her, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of realization. The footage showed her pointing at my door, Suite 1402, and it showed the entire rehearsal of the betrayal, the choreography of the lie being built for the camera in real time. I didn't say a word as the video played, letting the high-resolution evidence speak the language of truth that my sister had tried to overwrite. I looked at my father, Grant, who was standing in the wings of the ballroom, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple as he realized that the reliable daughter had not only survived the assassination attempt, but had brought the executioner's head to the party. Victoria, my mother, reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, her eyes darting toward the guests as she calculated the irreparable damage to their social standing. The $68,000 wedding was a corpse, but I was the one performing the autopsy in front of everyone who had ever doubted my worth. When the video reached the point where the actor leaned in to whisper to me and I visibly recoiled, slamming the door in his face, I paused the frame. The image of my own confused, innocent face hung over the room, larger than life, a silent testament to the fact that the only person who had been self-destructive was the one currently standing in a $2,800 bridesmaid dress. I turned the microphone back on, my voice echoing with a calm, forensic stability that cut through the tension like a scalpel. "This was the performance my sister paid $400 for," I said, the words falling into the room with the weight of lead weights. "She wanted you to see a story of a woman who wasn't good enough for her life, but the numbers don't lie, and neither does the surveillance." Liam was on his feet now, his shaking hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him so hard that the wood groaned. His gaze locked on the screen where the proof of my fidelity was frozen. He looked like a man who had been pulled back from the edge of a cliff only to realize the person who pushed him was standing right next to him. I looked at Kennedy, whose eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit, for a lie large enough to cover this, for a parent to jump in and save her. But for once, the golden child was alone in the spotlight. I felt a cold, sharp sense of completion, a realization that the $3.2 million gap had been bridged not by money, but by the undeniable power of a woman who refuses to be erased. I had spent 28 years being the reliable one, the one who worked 70-hour weeks and wore Target blazers while they indulged in a fantasy of their own making. But as I stood at that altar, holding the microphone and watching the wreckage of my sister's ego, I realized that I didn't need the $68,000 wedding or the $14,000 watch to define me. I was Harper Sterling, the senior forensic accountant who had just closed the most important audit of her life. I wasn't there to marry Liam anymore. I was there to divorce my family. I looked back at the screen, then at the stunned crowd, and I felt the weight of the Kingston Drive in my pocket, knowing that this was only the first chapter of the liquidation. I didn't need to say I do to a husband to find my value. I just had to say I am to the truth. The grand ballroom was silent, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and the stench of a dying legacy, and as I laid the microphone down on the altar, the sound of it hitting the wood was the last thing I would ever owe them. I walked down the steps, past my mother's reaching hand and my father's silent rage, and I headed for the exit, leaving the high-resolution evidence of their rot playing on a loop behind me. I had a black Chevrolet Tahoe waiting outside, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the cost of the trip. I was finally moving toward a future that was entirely, undeniably, my own. Before we begin the ceremony that clearly isn't happening today, I'd like to present a different kind of vow, one that is rooted in the uncomfortable reality of the truth rather than the expensive fiction we were all sold, I said into the silver microphone, my voice steady and devoid of the tremor that everyone in the grand ballroom expected to hear from a jilted bride. I shifted my weight slightly, feeling the cool air of the ballroom circulate around my tailored black suit as I raised my left hand to signal the technician in the booth, a man I had paid an additional $500 cash tip to ensure that my specific digital override would take precedence over the planned floral slideshow. At exactly 1:12 p.m., the motorized hum of the 20-foot projection screen dropping from the vaulted ceiling became the only sound in the room. a mechanical herald of the destruction that was about to follow as the lights dimmed automatically. The entire room of 185 guests sat in a paralyzed state of anticipation as the screen flickered to life, displaying what I had internally titled the Kennedy production, a high-definition surveillance loop that stripped away the layers of my sister's carefully curated performance. The footage began with the stark, unedited clarity of the Fairmont security system, showing Kennedy in her $500 silk robe standing by the ice machine with the predatory focus of a director on a film set. The guests watched in a silence so absolute and heavy that it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the grand ballroom, leaving only the clinical glow of the screen to illuminate their shocked faces. I didn't let the images speak alone. I pulled the small Kingston USB drive's data onto the secondary display, showing the digital paper trail that corroborated the visual evidence of her treachery. I leaned into the microphone, my gaze fixed directly on Kennedy, who was now shrinking against the ivory-draped pillars, and I began to read the financial signature of her malice out loud for everyone to hear. Transaction ID 7XH92210L, a $400 payment made via PayPal to the Ace Talent Agency for one professional extra, I stated, the alphanumeric characters falling into the room like heavy stones dropped into a still pond. The sound of my mother's Waterford crystal glass shattering against the marble floor was the only thing that broke the spell, the sharp crack of the expensive vessel echoing like a gunshot as she realized the social catastrophe was now permanent. Victoria's face was a mask of horror, not for the betrayal of her eldest daughter, but for the fact that the sterling name was being publicly dismantled in front of the very people she had spent decades trying to impress. Liam stood up slowly from the front row, his movements stiff and robotic as he processed the reality that the woman he had loved was the victim of a conspiracy, and the woman he had been comforted by was the architect of his pain. He turned his head with a slow, deliberate motion to look at Kennedy, and the expression of pure, unadulterated disgust that settled on his features was a more visceral victory than any court judgment I could ever win. It was a look that stripped Kennedy of her power, her charm, and her standing in a single second. And as I watched her wither under his gaze, I knew that every cent of the $68,000 non-refundable deposit had been an investment in my own liberation. The loop played again, showing Kennedy handing the wad of $20 bills to the man in the leather jacket, her lips moving as she pointed at my door with the same hand that had hugged me during the rehearsal dinner. I watched my father, Grant, sink into his chair, his hands covering his face as the realization hit him that his favored daughter's vanity had destroyed the last shred of family dignity he had left to protect. The guests were no longer looking at me with pity. They were looking at Kennedy with the kind of morbid fascination reserved for a train wreck, their hushed whispers replaced by a stunned collective realization of her sociopathy. I stood on the dais, the light from the projection screen casting my shadow across the altar, and I felt a sense of forensic satisfaction that was almost religious in its intensity. This was the audit of a lifetime, the moment where the hidden liabilities were finally brought to the surface, and the true cost of the Sterling family's facade was calculated to the final decimal point. Kennedy tried to speak, a high-pitched, warbling sound of denial beginning to form in her throat, but the evidence on the screen was too high resolution and too specific for any of her usual acting tricks to work. The PayPal receipt showed the timestamp of the transaction, which occurred exactly 2 hours after she had convinced my parents to increase her monthly allowance for her supposed acting classes. She had used our father's money to hire the man who would ruin his other daughter's wedding, a circularity of betrayal that was so perfect it almost felt scripted. Liam moved toward the center aisle, his eyes never leaving Kennedy, his jaw set in a hard, jagged line that signaled the end of any mercy she might have hoped for. The disgust in his eyes was worth more than the $14,000 Omega he had dropped, worth more than the $12,400 in flowers, and worth more than the 4 years I had spent believing I was the boring one. I looked out at the sea of faces, The aunts who had whispered about my sensible shoes, the cousins who had laughed at my $40 Target blazers, and the professional colleagues who had seen me as nothing more than a reliable drone. They were all watching the screen, watching the golden child pay for a lie, and the power dynamic in the room shifted so violently I could almost feel it in the floorboards. I was the one with the microphone, I was the one with the data, and for the first time in 28 years, I was the one who controlled the narrative of the Sterling family. I didn't need to scream or cry to be heard. I just had to present the facts with the same cold, unyielding precision I used to take down corporate embezzlers. The silence remained heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic sobbing of my mother and the soft whir of the projector-cooling fan as the loop finished its 5th rotation. I stayed at the altar for a long moment, allowing the reality of the situation to settle into the bones of everyone present, ensuring that no one could ever claim they didn't know the truth. I looked at the broken shards of the crystal glass on the floor, sparkling like diamonds in the dim light, and I realized that those fragments were all that was left of the life I was supposed to have. But as I turned to walk off the stage, leaving the projection of Kennedy's guilt glowing behind me, I didn't feel broken. I felt finished, in the way a perfect ledger is finished when the assets and liabilities finally balance out. The non-refundable deposit was a small price to pay for the look on Liam's face and the absolute silence of my sister's defeat. And as I walked past the front row, I didn't even stop to look at him. I had already moved on to the next phase of the liquidation, and as I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, the sunlight of Chicago waiting for me on the other side, I felt the Kingston drive in my pocket. The wedding was over, the family was fractured beyond repair, and the audit was moving into the corporate offices of Sterling Industrial, where the real crimes were waiting to be found. My name is Harper Sterling, and while the world watched the Kennedy production, I was already preparing the final report for the authorities, because in my world, there are no happy endings, only accurate ones. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the sound of the city drowning out the echoes of the ballroom, and I didn't look back at the $68,000 tomb I had built for my sister's ego. I had the truth, I had my dignity, and for the first time in my life, I had the absolute unyielding upper hand. Kennedy's carefully constructed life evaporated in exactly 6 minutes, the precise duration of the high-definition surveillance loop that stripped away her mask in front of every person who mattered to our social and professional standing. The transformation was absolute. One moment she was the tragic, silk-clad heroine of a family drama, and the next she was a caught criminal, exposed by the very technology she thought she could manipulate. Her own fiancé, a man named Julian who had been sitting in the 3rd row with a look of preemptive sympathy, did not wait for the lights to come up before he stood and broke off their engagement on the spot, his voice a low, jagged snarl that carried more weight than any of the rehearsed lines Kennedy had ever delivered. He looked at her not as a lover, but as a structural defect he was lucky to have identified before the foundation was poured. And he walked out of the grand ballroom without looking back, leaving his own reputation as a collateral casualty of the Sterling collapse. The silence that followed his departure was punctuated only by the frantic, wet sound of Kennedy trying to breathe through her panic, a sound that lacked any of the grace she had practiced in her acting classes. My parents, Grant and Victoria, were left standing in the wreckage of a $68,000 production that had transitioned from a wedding to a public shaming of historic proportions. Because the contracts for the venue, the 12-course catering, and the $12,400 floral arrangements had been signed in their names to maintain the illusion of family unity, they were forced to pay every single cent of the bill for an event that served as the site of their social execution. I watched my father pull out his American Express Centurion card to settle the final balance with the banquet manager, his hand trembling with a mixture of rage and profound humiliation that no amount of Sterling industrial profit could ever soothe. They had spent $68,000 to invite 185 of their most influential peers to witness the definitive proof that they had raised a sociopath and ignored a daughter of integrity. The irony was a cold, hard fact that sat in the room like the shards of my mother's shattered crystal glass. They had paid a premium price to be exposed as frauds. I did not stay to watch the final dissolution or to listen to the inevitable excuses that would start the moment the last guest scurried out the door. I walked out of the Fairmont Chicago and into the crisp, biting wind of the city, my mind already moving toward the logistical reality of my new life. Within 48 hours, I had secured a new apartment in the West Loop, a sleek, industrial modern space with concrete floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the skyline I had finally conquered. I didn't take a single piece of furniture from my old life, choosing instead to leave the remnants of my history behind like discarded skin. I blocked every single one of them, Kennedy, Grant, Victoria, and even Liam, severing the digital tethers that had allowed them to drain my energy for 28 years. I didn't need their explanations, their apologies, or their frantic attempts to balance the emotional ledger. I had the data, and the data told me that the cost of maintaining those relationships was far higher than the value they provided. As a final act of forensic accounting, I kept the $14,000 Omega Seamaster and the platinum engagement ring Liam had given me, categorizing them in my internal records as a non-negotiable consultation fee for the years of unpaid labor I had provided as the family's reliable anchor. It was a modest sum considering the $82,000 in loans I had paid off alone and the $3.2 million gap in lifestyle that Kennedy had enjoyed on my dime. I sat in my new living room, the space smelling of fresh paint and expensive coffee, and I looked at the ring sitting on my glass coffee table. It wasn't a symbol of love anymore. It was a physical manifestation of a debt that had been settled. I felt a sense of peace that was so profound it was almost physical, a weightlessness that came from knowing that I no longer had to account for anyone's lies but my own. My name is Harper Sterling, and I am 28 years old, a senior forensic accountant who finally audited her own life. I spent years wearing $40 Target blazers and working 70-hour weeks to prove my worth to people who viewed my reliability as a tool rather than a virtue. I watched my sister buy $1,200 sneakers with my father's money while I meal prepped in a dark apartment, and I stayed silent because I thought the truth would eventually be recognized on its own. I was wrong. The truth doesn't just reveal itself. It has to be presented, formatted, and projected onto a 20-foot screen in a grand ballroom. I learned that family isn't a biological mandate. It is a fiduciary relationship based on trust, and when that trust is breached, the only logical move is liquidation. The Sterling family name still exists on the side of a manufacturing plant, but in the circles that matter in Chicago, it is now a cautionary tale of vanity and unchecked narcissism. Kennedy moved to a small apartment in a less than glamorous part of the city after my father finally cut off her $6,500 allowance, her acting career permanently stalled by the fact that the most famous performance of her life was a staged betrayal. My parents are living in a quiet, bitter retirement in Lake Forest, the house on Briarwood Lane feeling more like a museum of their failures than a home. I, on the other hand, have never been more successful. My firm promoted me to Director of Forensic Investigations, and I no longer feel the need to hide my success or my style. I bought a 2024 midnight black Porsche Taycan with my own money, and when I drive through the West Loop, I don't look back at the mirrors. Cutting off a toxic relative is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival, a necessary amputation to prevent the rot from spreading to the rest of your life. It took a $68,000 wedding and a $14,000 betrayal for me to realize that my sanity was worth more than their approval. I am no longer the daughter they can ignore or the sister they can use as a background extra in their theater of lies. I am the one who holds the ledger, the one who knows the value of every second and every cent, and the one who finally balanced the books. As I look out at the Chicago sunset, the orange light reflecting off the glass of my new life, I realize that the most important audit I ever conducted was the one that led me here. The $3.2 million gap is gone, replaced by a wealth of self-respect that can never be seized by an Amex Black Card. I am Harper Sterling, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be, answerable to no one, and finally, undeniably, free. The silence of my new apartment is a luxury I worked 70-hour weeks to earn, and every time my phone remains quiet, I know I made the right choice. There are no more frantic calls from Victoria about social slights, no more demands from Grant for free financial consulting, and no more manipulative texts from Kennedy about her latest invented crisis. I have reclaimed my time, my identity, and my future from the wreckage of their expectations. I look at my desk clock, the same one that flickered at 11:24 p.m. on that Friday night, and I see that it is now a new day, a new hour, and a new beginning. My name is Harper Sterling, and while my family's story ended in a ballroom full of shattered glass and high-resolution lies, my story is just beginning. And this time, the narrative is entirely mine to write. I have the facts, I have the evidence, and I have the power to decide who gets a seat at my table. And for now, the only person I'm inviting to dinner is the woman who was brave enough to tell the truth.